When I say that Skull and Bones is exactly what you think it is, I mean it is both praise and criticism. We're going to start with exactly why I think it's good, and then we're going to turn to some of my concerns about its future after the beta, and that's really the most important bit, so make sure you stick around for that. So, let's begin with why is Skull and Bones weirdly good? You're drifting along in your ship on a mission for the pirate Kingpin, before suddenly you stop a merchant ship on the horizon. Shouting for your crew to speed up, your sails unravel, letting the fast-blowing sea air propel you forward. Your crew shouts with glee as you ram into the side of the merchant vessel, blowing a massive hole into its health bar, before you sail away, rotate your ship, and come back for more. You order your crew to fire their cannons this time, and they yell with giddy excitement as their careful aim pays off. The cannon fire hits the ship's weak point, and they begin to take on water. You smoothly sail in next to them and bark at your crew to begin boarding. They throw their lines over the enemy ship's deck until they tighten, and the helpless merchants are dragged in close. The boarding is complete, and your crew roar with triumph as you break a chest open, seeing that it's filled with both riches and exotic goods. You sail away, searching for the next poor soul to plunder, and make your vast pile of stolen goods even greater. That's the gameplay loop that Skull and Bones uses to sell itself to you, and during the beta period in which I tested Skull and Bones, it certainly sold itself well. There's undeniably a satisfying basis of gameplay here, with ship combat feeling really nice, backed up with suitably deep customization, and missions that sweep you straight into the loop and get you right into combat scenarios. Keep in mind that I'm judging the game before seasonal and paid content releases, but by seeing what's available in the beta so far, Skull and Bones seems to create an item economy that encourages you to plunder more and more ships and upgrade your own vessel. There are some problems with this however, and it'll be interesting to see how this is built upon the full release of the game, but for now, Skull and Bones is definitely giving the signs of an evolved at-sea version of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Of course, that particular comparison is a double-edged sword, for many reasons, but I'll come back to that later on. I'll start off with a block on combat, as it's the most important gameplay system on which the entire game leans, followed then by progression, and finally wrapping it all up with a section on my concerns for the full game. So, combat first. Combat in Skull and Bones is very different to what you remember from Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. For starters, the trajectory trails that you aimed with in Black Flag are gone, replaced by a reticle system that changes depending on the weapons you fire. This certainly helps weapons feel different, while keeping things precise for extended ship-on-ship combat. It's incredibly difficult to make the guns in ship-based combat feel different, as minus enhanced rumble effects, there's not really a way for guns to feel unique. There's no recoil on a ship, so it lies totally in the hands of the sound visual designers to make sure the ship-to-ship combat feels fresh for a long time. So, how have the developers at Ubisoft managed it? I think they've done a brilliant job, to be honest. With limited tools at their disposal and little to do with them, the developers have created a combat loop that was satisfying to play around with for hours on end. Whether that point of view will hold up in the full game remains to be seen, but the loud explosions of mortars and the roar of cannons hasn't gotten old yet. It all makes ship battles feel incredibly dramatic, with music swelling as you make your approach to a target and men from both ships shout orders to each other. Skull and Bones does a nice job of making you feel like you're in charge of a party of people as opposed to a ship, with exclamations and comments from your crew about what's going on being pretty common. Going back to the different forms of weapons that are available from the get-go, we have several forms of cannons, from close to long range, mortars, torpedoes, and ballistae to name a few. There are subclasses and elemental variants of many of these of course, as well as stronger variants that become unlockable through the blueprint system, but more on that in the next section of the video. All in all, Ship combat in Skull and Bones feels precise and satisfying, with enough variation in weapon types to keep things interesting. There's a significant amount of buildcraft here too, with each ship being allowed a different number of weapons and furniture, which adds passive buffs to your ship. Each ship has its own strengths, and there are several classes and subclasses of ships to choose from. Essentially, there's a lot here to make ship combat interesting, and you can factor in your friends for a little bit of strategic shipbuilding if you fancy. There is one thing I'm quite worried about though, and that's if combat will stay interesting later on down the line, as this is a full price $70 live service game where there are hundreds of hours meant to be dumped straight into it. Of course, I'll be going into more detail later on in the full review, which will be released sometime later this week or early next week, so make sure that you're subscribed with notifications on so that you know when that video drops. Now, let's talk about the most essential part of any live service game, or the most essential part of any live service that's going to survive anyway. It's time for progression. So the progression system in Skull and Bones works on a few different levels. On the first, you've got Infamy. That's how well known your pirate is, and by completing missions or sinking ships you can level up to unlock better items from merchants and traders. NPCs will also treat you differently the more you level up, which is a nice touch. As nice as this all is though, it doesn't actually affect you in game a huge amount, beyond what cosmetics you can buy and the much higher up items. The rest is all determined by what blueprints you have, and blueprints can be unlocked either by completing missions or by buying them from merchants scattered around the map. The better blueprints cost different currencies and gradually become more and more expensive. Finally, the power of your ship depends on both your ship level and the level of your weapons and furniture. It's a fair amount to take in, but I have a lot of concerns about this progression system. Over the beta period I played for a total of 8 hours. Across those 8 hours I reached the maximum infamy level of 6, collected a fair few ships, and had even begun chasing down blueprints for superior weapons. I would have played more, but I did unfortunately have the duty of watching Wales lose to England over the weekend, which was incredibly depressing. The fact that I've already reached the 6th out of 10 possible infamy levels concerns me though, as how much longer will it take before I'm the max infamy level? It worries me even more given the fact that the incentive to complete most quests in the game is infamy points, and if I reach max infamy, I'll have no reason to complete quests other than money. And the money that you earn in Skull and Bones goes mainly towards upgrades for your ship, but you'll also spend a fair amount of time on cosmetics. I'm not trying to sound like a broken record, but the cosmetic side of this game is another thing that worries me. If the full game launches with only this many cosmetics in a game that relies so much on aesthetics, I'll be thoroughly disappointed. The progression in Skull and Bones is throwing up far too many flags for my liking already, and the infamy problem is possibly the main one. Once you reach max level, how will the game incentivize you to continue doing any main missions? There's not really a story here, and sinking ships will let you more silver than completing missions will. I see a real danger of Skull and Bones becoming a slog, with missions only being a priority due to potential blueprints, and not for any instant rewards or anything even remotely interesting. Most of the quests are simple go there, sink the ship or ships, and come back affairs. So it's not like you'll be completing quests for how interesting they are, or by how much they stand out. It all leads back to combat, combat, and more combat. Skull and Bones is recently being advertised as a quadruple A video game, which is interesting, given that its scope is actually what concerns me the most. I think I made it pretty clear by now that Skull and Bones isn't a disaster like many were expecting, but there are still a fair few things that really worry me here. The biggest downfall and turn off this game will face is that comparison to Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. That game was enormous on every level, so much so that ship combat is only a very small part of its layers of game systems. I think that your enjoyment of the game is really going to depend on what your expectations are of what Skull and Bones will be. If you're expecting a huge open world game where you can leave your ship and explore, or the ability to cross swords with other pirates after you board their ships, then this just isn't the game for you. That's why I said that the comparison to Black Flag hurts Skull and Bones more than it helps it. Even though that's the biggest face value turnoff for most people, it's not my biggest worry. My biggest worry is that everything in Skull and Bones is pushing you to engage in combat. That's great, but after 20 hours, I can most certainly see that it's pretty good turn into this is boring. Of course, we'll have to wait and see about that until my full review comes out. But that is basically how the first 10 hours of the game go according to the beta. I was definitely starting to tire after about 9 hours, but I'd already hit the max infamy cap then, so I didn't really have a ton to do, and that's why it'll be interesting when the full game comes out. But that whole thing about me hitting the progression wall, that is my main problem with this game. With no real story, and only a narrow scope of gameplay to focus on, I can't see it remaining interesting to players for the hundreds of hours that Ubisoft is clearly expecting people to play this game for. It's very different to a fighting game or a shooting game. There's no in-depth weapon customization here due to the nature of weapons, no skill tree to unlock other abilities, and the battlefield never changes. However much you alter your ship, or the enemies you're fighting change, you're still shooting the same few enemies with the same few cannons that are very, very similar to each other, time after time. Sure, your raiding with your friends is pretty cool, but there isn't even proper PvP in this. At least I think so. I couldn't find any obvious signs of PvP, but I might be missing something, so let me know in the comments below. Essentially, all my worries about Skull and Bones are on the amount of content that it's possible to get out of a game like this, with no story and only one main gameplay system. There's some good groundwork here, but it's seriously lacking in additional features. It's also lacking in some graphical finesse, as whatever platform I played Skull and Bones on, it never looked good, and in fact I'd say it barely looked average. I'm seriously questioning its ability to survive in a market that already has Sea of Thieves in it, which is a far more flexible pirate fantasy. All I can do at the moment though, is review the full game when I have access to it. Everything will be far clearer then, especially when the monetization features are turned on and the rest of the game opens up. I'll say this, Skull and Bones definitely has a level of premise, but don't go raising your black flags and pre-ordering quite yet. I'd heavily recommend waiting for details to drop, as this has some serious red flags that are already raised from the beta and billowing in the wind. If you're interested to see my review, make sure that you subscribe, and I'll get it to you as soon as I can. See you all soon.